Okay, so for our National Advocacy panel, our moderator is going to be Amy Weissman, and Amy is the Assistant Director of the University Center for Human Rights. And the Center for Human Rights, very pleased to say, has been a collaborator with us on many of the events we do, and I think, like the Public Policy Center, really tries to hear from all of these different kinds of perspectives on whatever the issue is. And with that, I will turn it over to Amy.
Is it on? Yeah. Thank you very much, Pete. It's my great pleasure to be part of this exciting conference and to introduce three outstanding women who are working at the national and local levels to promote change in our immigration policy. And I'd like to introduce them as a group and then ask if perhaps we could start with Jennifer and move to Rosa and then Erica. I think that might be a good sequence. Sure. Immediately to my left here, this is Rosa Lozano. She is a second-generation immigrant from El Salvador. Her parents migrated to the United States as political refugees during the Civil War in El Salvador. She was brought up in the immigrants' rights and labor movement and has been a student organizer with United Students Against Sweatshops, fighting for garment workers through corporate accountability campaigns on her campus. She was the first youth organizer at Casa de Maryland and helped mobilize hundreds of undocumented students and youth across the state in passing the Maryland Dream Act that granted access to higher education to students regardless of immigration status. During her time at Casa de Maryland, she was also part of actions and mobilizations like Move the Game in response to SB 1070 in Arizona. Then to Rosa's left is Jennifer Chan. Jennifer is the Associate Director of Policy at the National Immigrant Justice Center in Chicago. She graduated from the University of Washington with a bachelor's degree in anthropology with a minor in human rights. During college, she studied abroad in Paris, France, and Bergen, Norway. Jennifer obtained her master in public policy from the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy. Prior to joining NIJC, Jennifer worked for We Belong Together, a campaign to ensure that women are treated fairly in immigration reform, and One America, the largest immigrant rights advocacy organization in Washington state. And at the end of our table is Erica Johnson. Erica joined the ACLU of Iowa in 2013 and is serving as the advocacy director, working to advance and protect the rights of all people, regardless of immigration status, and fighting back against laws, policies, and practices that harm and discriminate against any Iowan. She works with coalition partners and impacted communities across the state to push for positive measures on local, state, and federal levels. Please welcome our panelists.
Good afternoon. So, as many of you know, the Senate passed a bipartisan historic immigration reform bill in 2013, which, as other people have mentioned, seems a very, very long time ago. So since that failed to move forward in the House of Representatives, it's been widely acknowledged that our next chance to do anything like that again will be 2017 when we have a new president. But even without immigration reform legislation moving in the Senate or the House, we still have our hands very full with a number of other things immigration related, and immigration will still remain a very important issue as we go into the 2016 campaign and candidates fight to win immigrant voters. So between now and our next chance, immigration advocates are basically in defense mode. I'm going to talk about three key issues that we're heavily working on at the National Immigrant Justice Center, and those issues are implementing executive action, protecting immigrant children, and eliminating family detention. So the first issue, executive action, I just want to start with some background on how we got to this point. So when President Obama was running for office, he promised in his first year that he was going to address immigration reform, but obviously that never happened. Instead, he increased immigration enforcement to historic levels, and he is already on track to deport more people than any other president in our history. So in the face of congressional inaction, when it became clear that Congress wasn't going to be able to address our broken immigration system, the President decided to act within his legal authority to announce reforms that would provide temporary relief for American families until permanent solutions can be reached. So those reforms are the Deferred Action for Parents of Americans, DAPA, expansion of the DACA program, which is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, and then prioritizing our immigration enforcement. All of these things would have been included in the Senate immigration bill, and basically what it does is DAPA makes sure that parents of American children, or U.S. citizen children and lawful permanent resident children have relief from deportation. The DACA expansion, so I'm going to assume that I'll just provide more background on what DACA is. It's basically the DREAM Act. It provides people who have come here at a very young age relief from deportation. They're people who are practically American, but in paper. And the expansion removes the age cap. So people like Jose Antonio Vargas, who was 31, I believe, when DACA was announced, was ineligible for relief because he wasn't under 30. And so now people like him can apply for relief. The priorities make sure that enforcement concentrates on people who pose a risk or pose a public safety threat to our society instead of deporting mothers and fathers and people who are here working and so on. So in response to these reforms, Congress has introduced many attempts to repeal them. The opponents in Congress portray the executive actions as executive overreach, yet they fail to mention that they haven't offered any valid legislative fixes. In the courts, we have a state lawsuit moving along that challenges executive action, and a judge in Texas issued an injunction that has prevented DAPA and DACA from continuing to be implemented, but the enforcement priorities are still going forward. The court process is currently an appeals process, and it's expected to go on for a very long time. A lot of people don't think that the president will see any applicants while he's in office. So this will definitely continue to be an issue as the 2016 campaign goes forward, and candidates are already being asked where they stand with it. The second issue that I want to discuss is children. So last summer, there was a huge increase in the number of children arriving alone at the southern border seeking protection. The majority of these children are from the Northern Triangle countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, and they're fleeing extreme violence there. Honduras is the murder capital of the world, and El Salvador and Guatemala have the 2 highest rates of child murder in the world as well. Not only are these areas very violent, but children in particular are being targeted for this violence. And more often than not, parents are burying their children than children burying their parents. And it's been extremely tragic to see this go through. Now, the majority of these children are eligible for asylum protections and other existing protections that we have in the United States. In 2008, Congress unanimously passed legislation that provides additional protections for these children, recognizing that children are particularly vulnerable and that when they travel alone, they can't be expected to be able to explain why they need protection and what their needs are. And particularly thinking about these children, they come from countries where they're raised not to trust the police because, at worst, the police are complicit in the crimes, and at best, they're just powerless to stop it. So when they arrive on the border and Border Patrol asks them, why they need protection, they aren't always going to be the most forthcoming. Not to mention the fact that children, or anyone really who has survived trauma, it can be very difficult to talk about these things. So one of my colleagues at NIJC recently won asylum for 4 siblings. Two of the sisters in this family had been brutally raped in their home country. The youngest had been brutally raped since she was only 12 years old. And when she came to us, she was in complete denial of what had happened to her. And when we interviewed her to talk about her case, why she had come, she said nothing had happened, that nothing was wrong, that she just wanted to be reunited with her mom in the United States. But her older siblings were aware of the abuse, and they were able to talk about it, which is the only reason we knew it happened. And she was lucky. Not all kids have someone else who can, intervene and say, actually, that's not true. This happened to her. She needs protection. And luckily, because of the way our laws work, she had these chances to have time to recover, to build trust with an attorney. But what we're seeing in Congress now are attempts to repeal these protections. And to create an expedited process where children would never have access to child welfare experts, have access to attorneys. They would just meet with a Border Patrol agent and be sent back, in some of these proposals within a week, which would put us at great risk of sending children back into danger and to places where they may be killed. And indeed, some children who have been deported back have been killed. And this is another reason why this is such an important issue, is that although I think a lot of people on the ground see the problems with rolling back the laws, it's not 100% among Democrats, and certainly not among Republicans. And with a lot of the legislative proposals we see, we can be fairly confident that even if it passes Congress, that the president will veto it, but we aren't confident about that in this case. And the third issue I want to talk about is family detention. It's very closely related to the children. So alongside the child arrivals last summer, there are also an increase in family units. The majority of them are led by young mothers, and they're fleeing the exact same violence as the children. In addition to children being persecuted, women are also heavily persecuted in Central America. And Guatemala and El Salvador lead the region, yes, maybe the world as well, I can't remember right now. But they definitely lead the world in femicides, which is murders that are motivated simply because someone is a woman. And there are huge issues with domestic violence. And in fact, recently, within this last year, a court ruled that being someone who cannot get out of a domestic violence situation makes you eligible for asylum. So a large number of these families are eligible for asylum, like the children. However, they're being treated very poorly when they arrive on our southern border. So last June, we had 85 detention beds for families. And by the end of this fiscal year, so by the end of September, that will increase to nearly 3,800. Those are 3,800 beds for mothers and children. At the New Mexico Family Detention Center, which had about 650 beds, the median age of detainees was 6 years old. So the majority of people in these jails are children. And this is extremely harmful for survivors of violence, but particularly children. When kids are put in jail, their brains stop growing. There's an increased risk of mental disorders. And there's also an increased risk for sexual assault. So right now there are 3 detention centers. There have been allegations of sexual assault at 2 of them. The 3rd detention center opened in December, and many advocates view it as just a matter of time until we hear reports of sexual assault at this final detention center that's still being built, and when it is complete, it will be the largest detention center in the country, not just the largest family detention center, but the largest immigration detention center, period. In addition to all of these issues, all of these problematic factors with jailing families, this is also extremely expensive. The average daily cost for just normal immigration detention is $164. For family detention, it is close to $300 per person per day. But there are much cheaper alternatives. One is just releasing someone on their own recognizance. The majority of these women, as I've said, are asylum seekers, and there are many studies demonstrating that asylum seekers do not need to be in jail or put on any sort of supervision to comply with their court orders. They don't want to go back to their home countries. They want to work within our system to pursue protections, and when they're given attorneys, they have extremely high compliance rates. So there's really no need to continue detaining families. The United States tried to do this before under George W. Bush's administration, and this failed as well. So the Bush administration opened a large family detention facility that was challenged because of the conditions, which I've already talked about. Under the lawsuit, there was a settlement where they were forced to make reforms to try to improve it, but at the end of the settlement process, the judge who was monitoring it said, you know, you've made all of these reforms and you've done a good job of doing that, but at the end of the day, these jails are no place for children, and as Americans, we can do better. The Obama administration actually closed that detention center in 2009, so it's been quite a shock for them to reverse their policy now. And part of the reason for that is they say that they need to deter future migration. But when you're talking about people who are fleeing for their lives, they're going to flee no matter what. And advocates will continue to challenge the Obama administration. Is this really what he wants his immigration legacy to be? And if he doesn't shut it down under his administration, then it will continue to be a question for candidates whether they intend to make this their legacy as well. Now, just to tie up, in addition to these three issues, there are so many more immigration issues moving through Congress and through the government. I think the key things to pay attention to are, since there's this stalemate where, you know, anything really bad the president will veto, instead what we're seeing is legislators trying to affect policy through committee hearings. So there have been a number of hearings for Immigration and Customs Enforcement over the past few weeks, for instance, and questioning the ICE director on how they're using funding, really exercising their oversight to make sure they're filling detention beds, and so on. So those are the things we're working on right now, and I just want to emphasize that there's so much more going on than those three issues, and if you'd like more information on it, you can visit immigrantjustice.org. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. We're going to reserve questions until all of our panelists have made their presentation, so make sure to jot them down on your cards as we go so that you don't forget. Next is Rosa Lozano.
Hi, everyone. So I'm the National Coordinator, Worker Center Partnership Coordinator at the AFL-CIO, which is the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations. We're a federation of unions representing 56 unions that represent an approximate 12.5 million workers in the United States. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about just the labor movement perspective on the issue of immigration. But before that, I wanted to kind of open up my part by recognizing that I think it's very fitting that we're having this conversation this week, which marks the 5th anniversary of SB 1070 in Arizona, which has been one of the most draconian pieces of legislation that has passed in the history of our country, I think, within the immigrants' rights movement that essentially does promote racial profiling and self-deportation, and whose basic objective is attrition by enforcement. And so I just wanted to recognize that today, because as we're talking about this very important issue, there are folks that are directly affected on the ground in Arizona, resisting and fighting back against these kinds of attacks. So moving forward, I think for us as a labor movement, our participation or involvement with this issue is complicated. And I think that for me, it's very exciting to come into this kind of phase of labor where we're really embracing and recognizing the need to be a strong voice for immigrant workers. I think that we're recognizing that this is an issue that is important not just to our members, but to their families and to the communities that they are part of. So really coming to do this work on immigrants' rights from a holistic perspective of recognizing that we can't just organize individuals, that we have to organize entire communities. And that in doing so, we're really raising the floor, the conditions, living conditions for all workers, which is good for everyone. And one of the key ways that we're doing this through the AFL-CIO is through our new We Rise, Adelante We Rise initiative, which basically aims to mobilize, organize immigrant workers to build power on the job and in their communities. And its focus is basically to do that through education. We need to make sure that folks understand, especially with the new deferred action programs that were established by President Obama, that people understand what it is and what it isn't. So we're having intensive conversations and trainings with union leadership, with members, and with communities about what DACA is, what DACA expanded is, and what DAPA is, and talking to the massive community of legal permanent residents in this country about the benefits of becoming citizens. And so we're having these conversations, right, obviously because they're necessary. We're using this as an agitational moment as well, because we need people to understand that, A, this is not a permanent solution, that this was only a first step in the right direction, and that as labor, we're going to continue to fight for full inclusion of our brothers and sisters. And recently, we actually trained 200 union leaders, Central Labor Council leaders, and State Federation leaders to be able to go back to their areas, their regions, to further train and really get buy-in from their affiliates and their community members about this issue. And I think for us, it's really, I want to just throw some numbers out there for you that, yes, like we believe that this is the right thing to do, and I think that many people have already touched on it, that this is beyond, politics, it's beyond analysis. This is about human lives, and for us, it's also about how we're reflecting, I think, our principles as a country. And so for us, it's really important that we continue to fight to set the agenda, to shift the political direction that we're going in, that we truly reflect our ideals of inclusion, justice, and dignity. And I think for us, we're really honing in on the worker perspective of how that's being played out. We know that undocumented workers are consistently more vulnerable in the workplace. We know that employers exploit the reality that workers might not report wage theft, that they might not report being injured on the job. And in fact, currently there are 8 million workers that go to work without full rights and protections. And undocumented workers experience the highest rates of harassment, injury, and death on the job. And actually there was an OSHA report that was just released that reported that the highest deaths on the job are happening to foreign-born Latino workers. and that's just the ones that are being reported. And so for us, this is baffling, and it is a priority to make sure, A, that workers understand that regardless of deferred action or whatever is happening or not happening in Congress, that they have full rights under the law as workers, that labor law applies to them regardless of status, and that's something that we're needing to echo on all levels of our structure. And especially important with my position within our Worker Center program is really building coalition with faith organizations, with student organizing organizations, with worker centers, and other allies to make sure that we're really creating a network of support for workers and their families around some of these issues. And one of the things that is extremely important or crucial is the work that's being done around wage theft. Right now, I think it's about every week, $56.4 million are lost in cases of wage theft. And this is in New York, LA, and Chicago. So that means that $56.4 million are being stolen from workers each week in these three places. And that's just from the reports that we've gotten. Who knows what's the reality for what's not on record. And so we have to make sure that there are institutions, if it's not labor in a particular place, that it's an institution that is trusted by the community, that folks know that is the place to go for help. That is the place to go to make sure that you're getting your wages back. That is the place to go to make sure you're reporting being injured on the job. And that's the place to go if your employer is using your status against you. We've seen this play out through workplace raids. And that's another piece that as labor movement, we're really being intentional about educating ourselves and the people we work with to understand, okay, what's going to be our response? Especially thinking about, okay, let's say DACA expanded moves forward. Let's say DAPA moves forward. How are we playing a role in making sure that employers aren't using that process to attack workers, to retaliate against workers that are trying to make sure that they're getting their rights met on the job. So I think for us, this is really about an inclusionary process. And I think, regardless of what's transpired in the past, it's really about cultivating long-lasting, genuine relationships with the community and with the institutions that they are a part of already, be it faith or other. And I think for me, it's also, being a Latina, being the daughter of immigrant parents, it's particularly important for me because I think that this is where there's a lot of potential here to really shift the direction that our country is going in when it comes to immigration and when it comes to workers' rights, because we're seeing attacks on both fronts across the country happen. And I think it's also coming at a time when the importance of making the connections is even more critical. We've, especially with, all the different dynamics or ways that employers are trying to divide our movements through, class, through race. I think that as a labor movement, we are clocking that. We're recognizing it, and we're trying to adapt and think about longer-term solutions and really trying to get to the root of some of these issues. And this is most recently was formulated through a committee for racial and economic justice that was just formed at the AFL-CIO as an attempt for us as labor to recognize that historically there have been excluded workers, that there have been excluded communities, and so this committee was formed to make sure that we're addressing that. And that moving forward, we are creating spaces of leadership and empowerment to folks that haven't had that access. And I think that through that avenue, us as my role in the Worker Center program, we're attempting to build bridges between workers that have that there are tensions there, right? And we're talking about low-wage Black workers, we're talking about low-wage immigrant workers, but specifically brown Latino workers. And so we're really trying to figure out, okay, what are the common denominators and what are some of the solutions we can bring to that as labor? You know, can we do workplace trainings? Can we do apprenticeships to get folks access direct lines to good paying jobs? Can we pass policies on a local level to ban the box so that folks that have been previously incarcerated, you know, don't have that follow them throughout the entirety of their life? And so these conversations are happening, and I think for us, we're really seeing the issue of immigration tied into many other priorities for us. And moving forward, it'll be exciting to be a part of that new history, but be really important and critical, I think, to our survival as a labor movement, but also in kind of lifting the floor of living conditions for everyone. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Rosa. Erica?
Yeah. Got a couple of slides, I think. If they're, I'll put you in charge, whoever, of flipping them. There's not all that many. But thanks for having me. Erica Johnson is my name. I'm the Advocacy Director for the ACLU of Iowa. And for those who don't know, the ACLU is the American Civil Liberties Union. Nationally, it's a group that's been around for coming up on 100 years. Really long time, and in Iowa, 80 years. We're one of the oldest affiliates. Each state has an affiliate, and so in Iowa, we've been around a really long time too. Fighting things like racial profiling, voter suppression. Recently won our lawsuit against the Secretary of State who was trying to suppress votes in Iowa. I don't know if folks heard. Good win. And then secondly, advancing the rights of all Americans regardless of immigration status, race, or gender identity. So that's just kind of an overview, a background. And then the next slide is sort of like a recap of everything that folks have said so far, I think, in theory, which sort of, I don't know, as I've been sort of listening and thinking this morning, it seems like one of the big things in my mind right now is like, geez, what a mess, right? And the second thing, so because of the lack of congressional action and this executive action, which is good, it's a good first step, but it's not the end-all be-all. There's a lot of work still to do. It sort of also makes me think they should really do something about that, right? And so the question then that we're, I think, at the point of now is who is the they? And at some point we have to realize that the they is us. And so that's where we go from here, I think. And so that's what I wanted to talk about really is a state and local advocacy component of all of this. So there's a paper that was put together recently by this group, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and it really looks at the Midwest specifically and what states and localities are doing in the Midwest to address, to really become more welcoming places for immigrants. It's a really helpful paper. I brought one copy if you want to look at it, but otherwise there's you can write the web link down there if you want to. But yeah, kind of building off of what Rosa was just talking about with the labor movement and how they're moving to be more welcoming, it's sort of, we're realizing that it's really in all of our best interests to move in that direction. And so I wanted to talk through some of the most compelling things that states and localities are doing to advance, to be more welcoming places. So the next slide is a visual. I'm all about the visuals. Two big things, right, that some folks have talked about a little bit already. One is in-state tuition, and the other one is driver's licenses. So driver's licenses in particular for undocumented immigrants. So what we know is that there's 18 states, Iowa is not on that list, that offer in-state tuition to undocumented immigrants. I didn't have a fancy map for that one, sorry. And mostly they were decided by legislation, so states pass state level legislation, but there's also been a couple of decisions you'll see from the Board of Regents that have just sort of made an administrative call and said, this is a direction that we want to move in. Again, Iowa is not on that list, unfortunately. And then the other big thing, driver's licenses. This is something that we have been working on in Iowa, and I'll dig into that a little bit more here in a second. But so there's 10 states now that offer driver's licenses to undocumented immigrants, and then 2 jurisdictions, DC and Puerto Rico. So 12 jurisdictions in total that do. We lost one last election. Oregon used to offer driver's licenses to undocumented immigrants, but there was a big, huge, well-funded push by an anti-immigrant force in Oregon, and they lost that by a voter referendum during the last election, which is unfortunate. But hopefully we'll have Iowa to add to that list soon. And then just some other examples of things that localities are doing to welcome immigrants. A lot of municipalities are forming what they're calling sort of new American offices, or offices to welcome new Americans. So some bigger cities like Chicago, and this is, again, all detailed in here, Chicago and Detroit, Dayton, I think, all have sort of these new things that are housed in the mayor's offices or city municipal offices to really hone in on what localities can be doing to do things on a local level that are welcoming. So like helping immigrants access municipal services, education, social services, honing in on local economic development initiatives, marketing, community engagement, those kind of things. And so in Iowa, what does that look like? Getting even more local. I think that's the next slide. More pictures. It's fitting that we're here in Iowa City meeting, not just because the university is here, but because you all passed a great resolution 2 weeks ago, right? Is it 2 weeks ago? Allowing residents who don't necessarily have social security numbers to get municipal ID. So this is, again, sort of along the lines of making sure that immigrants feel welcomed and have access to city services, things like utilities. You can all speak more about the municipal ID card more than I can, certainly. But that's one great victory that we've had here in Iowa, and that was due in large part to the advocacy efforts of local community members, right? This stuff doesn't just happen by itself. People have to be asking for it. People have to be organizing. They have to be doing things to make this happen. We know that if we leave all the decisions up to Congress, it's either not going to happen or it's going to take 3 decades to get there. So that's one really great example, and that's the picture here on the left. The picture, these are from Facebook, so if you want to find out more, you can go to these Facebook groups and like them, follow them, etc. The picture then, the snapshot of the Facebook page on the right is a group that's recently started called La Fuerza Latina, which is a group that's been started at Drake University in Des Moines. There was already a Latino cultural group on campus that focused on the more cultural side of Latino culture, so the food, the music, film, the arts, those kind of things. And there was a group of students that really wanted to see some more advocacy-driven organizing, a group on campus that was more focused on that. And so they came together, created a name, got a petition passed in the student government committee to be recognized as an official group on campus, and are now doing things like meeting with the president of Drake University to try to get them to include a component in the school's welcoming document, I'm not sure what it's called, that says that we welcome undocumented students, not just students regardless of gender identity or race or background, but regardless of immigration status, which is huge. Again, because Iowa is one of those states that does not allow in-state tuition for undocumented immigrants, and it's kind of like a taboo thing for us to talk about because of that. So, a great group that's doing fantastic things. Several members of that group are also traveling around to the different high schools in the Des Moines area, in the central Iowa area, and meeting with principals and guidance counselors and explaining what DACA is and saying, hey, I don't know if you know this, but DACA has really contributed to addressing the high dropout rates among Latinos in our state. And whereas before, high schoolers, before DACA was enacted, high schoolers a lot of times didn't really see the point of studying, getting good grades, and graduating, because what's the point? You can't get a job, those kind of things. You might be deported, or your parents might be deported, or whatever. But now that DACA is in place, high schoolers understand that not only can they get a job, but they can access higher education now. And so, like I said, the small group of DACA recipients, Dreamers in Des Moines, are going around to different guidance counselors, admissions offices, and some different community colleges in Iowa State, and explaining to them that DACA is something that people should care about and should be actively involved in advocating for, those kind of things. The map in the middle is a map of Iowa. It's kind of hard to see, it's kind of little. But that's a map showing the 20, I think that one has 26 shaded counties, but technically we're up to 28 counties in Iowa that no longer honor ICE detainers. ICE detainers were brought up earlier, and along in the context of the new secure communities, the rebranded secure communities. That was a part of the the executive action by President Obama in November of 2014. So ICE detainers are when local police can hold people past what they've already served time for. So up to 48 hours plus weekends and holidays. But what that means is that they're being held without any charges. They're being held in our county jails without any charges. And so we put together the ACLU. We sort of drove this effort, but it's an effort that has been ongoing for years and years and years in the state of Iowa. Advocates have been pushing back against this practice for a long time. We drafted a letter that went out to all 99 counties, all sheriffs across the state, and said, hey, we don't think you should be honoring these ICE detainers. They're not mandatory, as was said earlier, so you don't have to. You're not reimbursed by the federal government for housing these folks in jails, so county taxpayers are covering the cost of this. And what you're doing has been found to be unconstitutional in other states. Hasn't been found to be unconstitutional yet in Iowa, but that's just because we haven't heard of any cases. So if you're holding someone without having any valid charges, that's something that we consider in this country to be not right, unconstitutional, so don't do it. And so together with a lot of immigration attorneys and advocates around the state, we met individually with a lot of sheriffs to follow up on the letter and say, what do you think about this? Is this a practice that you'll discontinue? And we heard back from 26 that said, yeah, we agree with you. That's something that we don't want anything to do. We don't want to have anything to do with, which is great. And then we found out a couple months later that apparently sheriffs talked to each other and they found out that there was actually 28 that are no longer honoring ICE detainers. The caveat is that doesn't necessarily mean that the ones that aren't shaded are. It just means that I haven't had time to call all 99 sheriffs and ask them if they are. We do know that there's 2 that said at the end of last summer, right? Yeah, at the end of 2014, that they were going to go ahead and continue to honor ICE detainers. And so that's Marshall County, Marshalltown, and Woodbury County, which is Sioux City? I grew up in southeast Iowa. I'm really bad at northwestern Iowa. Yeah, it's one of the northwestern ones. So Woodbury County and Marshall County are continuing to honor ICE detainers. We haven't followed up with them since the president's announcement on executive action to find out if what they think of that, but that would be a good next step for us. What else? Oh, Iowa Safe Roads. Iowa Safe Roads is the catch-all coalition that has been built over the last year and a half or so, intentionally focused on building a broad coalition of stakeholders across the state in order to pass driver's licenses for undocumented immigrants. The legislation is actually presented first in 2005, so this is a conversation we've been having for 10 years in Iowa, and we haven't gotten anywhere with it. In 2012, folks remember, the Iowa Department of Transportation and Governor Branstad, after DACA, the first round of DACA was announced, they decided that they weren't going to go ahead and offer driver's licenses to DACA recipients, which people disagreed with, and people pushed back against and said, no, we think you should, and here's why. So after some really intense organizing advocacy efforts, and literally the last week of 2012, right before the legislative session started in 2013, we got them to reverse that decision, and they did decide to grant DACA recipients driver's licenses. So building off of that momentum from that really fast and furious campaign at the end of 2012, legislation was presented at the Iowa State House to pass a broader driver's license bill that would grant driver's licenses to all undocumented immigrants in Iowa. There was a couple of hearings, didn't go anywhere. Again, it was presented this year, didn't go anywhere. And so what we're doing is we're trying a different approach. So in 2005 and then 12 and 13 probably, the approach was sort of a very moralistic, humanistic, moral imperative, right? Like, we need driver's license in Iowa because we've got people driving and it's the right thing to do. These are members of our communities, they deserve driver's licenses. And the response to that was what we've sometimes grown to expect from a certain portion of the vocal opponents of immigrants, is that they're breaking the law. We've got to follow the rule of law. Giving them a driver's license would be a privilege that they don't deserve, that kind of argument. And so we realized at some point that that argument wasn't working out for us. We were losing. And so we started approaching local law enforcement and talking to police officers around the state and asking them what they thought of this. And surprisingly, got some really good feedback. And so at this point, law enforcement are the ones that are really leading the charge on this movement to pass driver's licenses in the state of Iowa, which makes total sense. It's a common sense argument, right? It's about road safety. If you have people driving, you want to make sure that they know the rules of the road, have been tested, are insured. And that applies to all of us, especially insurance companies, but to all of us who are driving on Iowa's roads. And if you're law enforcement, what's the first thing that we're asked for if you're pulled over, if you're stopped on the street or whatever? An ID, right? Can I see some ID? So law enforcement wants to know who they're dealing with in our communities. And for immigrants who don't really have access to that kind of valid form of ID, again, some of the same arguments are the municipal ID here in Johnson County. Law enforcement really sees that as an effective tool for community policing. Businesses are also sort of jumping on board with this. So anyway, I put this up here, the Iowa Safe Roads. Check out the website, iowasaferoads.com. Pretty simple, iowasaferoads.com. And you can kind of dig in a little bit more the facts and figures about why this is a positive initiative for the state of Iowa. You can see the list of supporters, including the 13 law enforcement officials. I think yours is on, your sheriff. I keep looking at Amy as if she's looked at the list recently, but the 13 law enforcement officials that are signed on, the victims advocates groups, the businesses, et cetera, who have signed on to that. And you can also sign on. And so the last slide then, I think, is like, what do we, how do you get involved then? So there's lots of other things happening. I just rushed over 4 of the exciting ones that are at the forefront of my mind. Just listening to the other presenters have reminded me of other things too, but for the sake of time, I think if you're sitting here thinking, what can I do? How can I be involved in these things? It is really about local coalitions, right? It's really hard. I've been doing this for coming up on 10 years now, advocacy in Iowa, and it's really hard to get people excited about federal comprehensive immigration reform. Like, even those words, you say those words and people's eyes kind of glaze over and they're like, I don't know what it sort of has taken on a nebulous meaning. I think somebody mentioned that before. And reaching out to Congress is sometimes something that people think is intimidating, they don't want to do. So I think it really does start locally. And again, there's proof of that in the things that I just mentioned, the municipal ID win, the ICE detainer win, the eventual driver's license win. So all of those things, like, it's the way you get started is starting locally. So connect with people locally. Identify stakeholders in your community. So immigrants, DACA recipients, city leaders, law enforcement, faith, community groups, business owners, et cetera. Connect with them and do something. I already mentioned the driver's license website. If folks want to meet with your local sheriff and your chief of police, other law enforcement officials in this county or in some of the cities in this county, that would be really helpful. I've got a sign-up sheet that I'm going to pass around. If any of these things are exciting to you, I want you to sign up, and I will be in touch with you. Another big thing that we're hoping folks can help with is fighting back against some of these nasty enforcement activities, like Pastor Max is deportation and other things that we know are happening in the community by making sure that our community is well educated on what our rights are. So I've got English and Spanish, what we call bust cards. These are things that you can keep in your wallet to tell you what to do if you're stopped by the police or immigration agents. So again, I'll pass all these things around, but please be in touch.
Thank you. Okay, first question. It's not dedicated or directed to any particular panelist, so I'll let you decide who would like to address it. Aside from voting, what else can the average citizen do? We hear and read about deportation, detainment, femicide, infanticide, etc., and it all sounds like it's out of our reach to make a difference.
Yeah, that's depressing. Well, I will say that I'm just going to tackle the deportation question. I think that, you know, the same way that we've been seeing some of the more atrocious deportation enforcement roll out locally, we're also seeing a lot of the more inspirational and effective resistance locally as well. And so I think that it's all about the perceived unity and strength that is seen. And I know that in Iowa there's a very rich environment of organizations, faith-based, non-faith-based, labor, that are doing a lot of work around immigrants' rights. And there's one in particular, because I am the Worker Center coordinator for the AFL, which is the Center for Worker Justice of Eastern Iowa. I was lucky enough to be able to visit their center yesterday, and they're kind of a very prime example of a space that's built for empowerment, and that a lot of the leadership of folks that are talking to the community about these important issues, about know your rights, about learning English, about really a lot of services that are meant to be inclusive and integrate folks into this community are happening there and are being led by very strong folks on the ground. And so I would very much encourage folks that are here today to seek that organization out and participate in some of the programs that they're leading.
Anyone else want to comment?
Yeah, I think, I mean, again, it's all local, right? Like if you're talking about like solving mass incarceration or global poverty or hunger, like these terms are actual problems, but they're not local issues. And so working to identify what a local issue is in your community, whether it's wage theft, it's a huge thing that's going on in Iowa, and figuring out who are the most impacted people, who cares the most, and getting that group together around you. I mean, it's about building relationships and starting locally.
I think it's also important to keep in mind how much just one phone call can make a difference. So a few weeks ago, I circulated a letter that House representatives had signed on to support eliminating what is known as the bed quota. So under congressional appropriations, immigration enforcement is supposed to detain 34,000 people on average per day. And I sent this letter out, and someone called the representative saying, "Why didn't you sign on to this letter?" And his staffer called me and was like, "What is this?" And I told him, he's like, "Oh, we'll definitely sign on next time, and like please keep us in the loop and we'll support this." So don't discount your own voice.
Great. Well, this is a similar question building on your response here, directed to Erica. I live in a small rural area without a lot of diversity or attention given to immigration and undocumented immigrants. Are there still issues that we should try to keep an ear out or eye on? Ear out for, eye out for? Anything we can do to help? You've answered this to some degree, but maybe focus on rural issues, I guess?
Rural issues? Well, I think, I mean, in Iowa, like, we live in a deceptively large state, right? I mean, like I said, I grew up in southeast Iowa, and I'm bad at northwestern Iowa in general. Like, I don't, yeah. And it takes a really long time to get anywhere. You have to drive. And so people are pretty disconnected, I think, largely, and people are isolated to a certain extent. And so when you think about, I mean, just to name like some of the big issues right now that have been talked about, so DACA and DAPA, there's a lot of misinformation out there. A lot of people have no idea what's going on with these programs. They think they're canceled, or in some cases, there's some bad actors out there who are giving unsolicited bad legal advice to people and encouraging people to fill out forms about apply for DACA without there actually being a mechanism to apply for DACA yet. And so I think, especially if you're in rural places, figuring out like what the hot topics are in your community again, and plugging in to educate your community as to what actually is going on. There's a lot of misinformation, and so that's one thing. I think meeting with schools, again on the DACA thing, schools have a really important role to play on making sure the community has good information about DACA specifically. And then guidance counselors, when we look at higher education and accessing higher education, I think that's another really clear thing. Law enforcement, there's all sorts of things that we can be doing to build relationships with law enforcement to help them understand how to build trust with the immigrant community. Wage theft, English language funding, all kinds of things that could keep going.
I saw my name. I'm nervous.
Rosa says your name. The next question is for Rosa. Looking, I think, at more strategically how you approach various political interests in the system. Republicans generally, meaning especially CEOs or corporate entities like factories, large business interests, I think assuming that Republicans generally represent those interests more than Democrats, generally oppose organized labor unions, but wouldn't they benefit the most from having access to immigrant workers the unions are trying to embrace?
I mean, I think we all benefit from having more inclusionary labor movement, right? So yeah, I mean, I think I better spend my time thinking strategically about how we can create spaces of empowerment and encourage folks to participate in their unions or in campaigns that promote raising the floor for all workers, like Fight for 15. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about whether or not I think Republicans acknowledge or will acknowledge that this is a benefit to them. I would hope that if, there's been a lot of talk today about, kind of the wake-up call that Republicans need to have if they're going to kind of hone in on the potential political capital of, the Latino community in particular. And I just don't think, speaking as a Latina woman and having many generations of family in this country, or extended family in this country, I think what I'll say is that I think we also have a lot stronger of a memory than folks think we do. And regardless of whatever steps or things are made now by Republicans or other political parties, we're never going to forget individuals or parties or organizations or institutions that didn't see our human value to begin with. And we're not going to forget folks that not just turned the other cheek, but in fact led the way for a record number of deportations. And so I think that there's a wave of accountability that needs to happen, that is happening. I think we saw that in the last congressional elections. And so I think that really it's about, what's the part that we're doing to empower folks on the ground. We know what needs to happen in Congress. We know what needs to happen on a national level. But until that happens, we're going to continue to pressure. But until that happens, we really have to prepare folks on the ground to defend themselves and their rights.
I believe this is best addressed to Jennifer. The question is, how do women or children know there is asylum? How do they know they can apply for asylum? What about the concept of asylum? Is it assumed that they know it? When released from the detention center, what rights do they have?
So it is not assumed that they know about asylum. Some of them do know about it, but that's why it's important to have proper screenings. So for those women who are in detention centers right now. That's a big if. They are put into removal proceedings, and all immigrants are not entitled to an attorney. That includes children. So that is one of the major problems in cases where you do see people released. Sometimes, they don't even have a way to get to their family in the United States. They're just dropped in the middle of nowhere. And, a lot of these detention centers, well, one is in Pennsylvania, the other two family detention centers are in Texas. They're kind of left with no way to move forward, and there are incredible networks of religious organizations, legal services, and so on, who are doing everything they can to make sure these families are connected to services. That is the major goal, is connecting to them to those services. Because beyond that, they don't really have very many rights. They have the right to go through the removal proceeding process, but they need attorneys, and NIJC is one of those legal service providers. We've been seeing an increase in family releases in the area, but it's been a huge issue trying to get in contact with those families and also to have the resources. Asylum cases are extremely difficult. They require a lot of resources, and NIJC relies on a large network of pro bono attorneys, but having to place these cases can be very difficult because sometimes they move so quickly that a pro bono attorney just simply can't put it together quickly enough, because oftentimes they haven't had a lot of experience with asylum, and so they need a lot of guidance. But in other times, it moves so slowly. It'll take 3 years to be resolved, so it can't be placed with a pro bono because you have to babysit it and to know how to follow up with the offices and so on. So it's very complicated.
Erica, this is a technical question for you. People can get driver's licenses when they have visas or assigned social security numbers for a certain amount of time, I believe. Would Iowa lawmakers be more comfortable giving driver's licenses to not all undocumented immigrants, but instead to people with ITINs? ITIN numbers? Yes.
I think one of the things, and I'm sort of struggling to remember, but the issue has come up before in Iowa City and in other places around the state where people have tried to have registered their homes, their mobile homes, under false numbers. And so there's a conversation happening about working with the Iowa Department of Transportation to try to get them to engage in administrative rulemaking, which would allow them to accept other numbers other than social security numbers, like the IT number, for people to register their motorhomes, which are technically considered vehicles because of the wheels. So I think something similar could, in theory, be done through the process of administrative rulemaking, but that would take the political will of the Iowa Department of Transportation to shape its leadership from the Iowa governor. So at this point in time, it doesn't look like that's likely to happen, which is why we're instead focused on some sort of legislative fix that would change the law to say, to broaden the category of what people could use. Does that make sense? Administrative versus legislative.
Well, I was just going to add to that there are examples of similar laws that have expanded what can be used to obtain driver's licenses in other places. So in Washington, D.C., there's a very extensive process, but the main thing that they're looking for is that you live in D.C. And that you are who you say you are. And in Maryland, they use not the ITIN number, but kind of in the same idea, having to prove that you've paid taxes in the state for 2 years, along with a variety of other things that you have to prove. But this would be in place of, having to show a social security card.
Do you want to explain to Erica or Rosa what an ITIN number is?
An ITIN number is a tax ID number, and so IRS assigns this number to someone that wouldn't file their taxes under
this was my passion. I pursued it in so many ways that, everything I had done leading up to getting this work spoke in my favor. And it's to the point where my work doesn't even necessarily feel like a job, but more like a fun hobby. Except when I have to watch congressional hearings all the time.
So, yeah, I think even the concept of college was something that, at least for my family, and I know for many in my community, is not always an assured thing. I was the first person in my family to go to college. And so, I would have really wanted to go to college for something that I loved. I think I thought about college as a place where I needed to find something that I could, come out with and support my family. But I think in that process, I was exposed to a lot of different things. And I think what I ended up falling into was things that I am passionate about, that I wanted to fight for, that I wanted to be part of a larger movement. And I think that's how I found the immigrants' rights movement and the labor movement. But I think overall it's about knowing yourself, knowing your strengths, and figuring out what you want to contribute to, I think is a huge piece in making that decision. And I think that'll land you where you need to be and where we, as a broader movement, need you the most.
Yeah, all of that, and I think, to a certain extent, a lot of this is completely out of your control, right? Your life experiences. I ended up in South America for a year as an exchange student. I wanted to go to Europe, but I ended up in Ecuador. Exactly, and it really completely changed my life. And I also happened to be in Chicago during the 2006 mega marches, and seeing millions of people, marching for this cause that I was sort of beginning to connect with. I think it sort of just depends. Your life leads you where it's going to lead you. You have a certain say in that to a certain extent. But I came back to Iowa to do organizing because it seemed like there was a need, and so that's the other thing. Where does your life take you? What are you choosing? Where is it taking you without choice? And then where's the great need? And rather, again, going back to sort of where it started, rather than saying, wow, they should really do something about it, and the nebulous they, which a lot of times is older white men in suits, rather than saying they should do something about it, I should do something about it, and figuring out how to do something about it, whatever it is. Or whom they